Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So this morning we talked about the first two periods in Dogen's life. We talked about the formative and the transformative, and now we're moving on to the reformative period. So this is the third period of the four. It covers roughly 1227 to 1243. So this is the period that begins with Dogen's sort of gradual efforts to establish his practice, his approach to practice in Japan. He establishes a thriving Sangha, he attracts some followers, doesn't immediately get the kind of patronage from the powerful members of society that he maybe would want or need. So there are reasons for that. It might be he comes off as a bit arrogant, thinks he knows better. Maybe he wasn't that great at sort of playing the political game. We don't really know. Also, one of his problems was that actual Chinese missionaries had more credibility when it came to, bringing Chinese practice into Japan. So, I mean, he's not Chinese, he's Japanese, he's gone there and come back. So there's a number of reasons why maybe he has a little bit of trouble sort of getting a foothold. But that's sort of the general outline, or the kind of main things about this period. So once he comes back to Japan, Dogen goes back to Kenninji, goes back to Myozen's temple where he had trained before. One of the first things he does is to write the Fukan Zazengi, the universally recommended instructions for Zazen. So it's interesting because Kenninji was under the umbrella of Tendai, was sort of doing Rinzai practice and various things. So apparently he's writing his manifesto, right? He's sort of launching a new approach in the midst of a place that wasn't really doing the kind of practice that he had in mind. Wasn't really doing what he brought back and what he wanted to establish. So he's in the midst of that, trying to do something different, right? So he also tries to simplify the forms, the rituals, the ceremonies that were happening at Kenninji and perhaps other Rinzai temples. So, Rinzai has a set of forms. These are being carried out. He wants to simplify this. Some of those rites and rituals and ceremonies were for the protection of the state. Some were to produce some, magical kinds of effects. In Japanese Buddhism at this time, this is not uncommon. He's interested, though, in making a shift from what we might call the externals of practice or of Buddhism, the rituals, the forms, the appearance, and more toward the internals of actual personal transformational practice. So somehow he thinks the time is now. The time is right to make this shift away from the appearances and the externals, more toward what's going on in the individual, what's going on inside, what's the transformation that's happening for practitioners. So as we saw a little while ago, various kinds of new Buddhism are arising during the Kamakura Jidai. Tendai is one of the old Buddhist schools. It wasn't so happy about the competition that's now arising from all of these new schools and sects. So the Tendai leaders try to suppress both Zen and Jodo Shinshu. So these folks were not friends. All right, there's competition happening and folks were feeling uncomfortable. But Dogen said people didn't need expedient practices to get them out of their difficulties and into a pure land, because there was no, he says, there's no age of Mappo. There's no age of the declining of the Dharma. The other two ages don't exist either. So he says there are not these three ages of Dharma. Mahayana teaching doesn't divide time into these three ages, and anyone who practices should be able to attain the way, not dependent on what time you're born into or the circumstances of Mappo and the degeneration of the Dharma. So in 1230, Dogen leaves Kyoto. Kyoto is heavily Tendai. He goes south and he settles in an abandoned temple. So Kyoto was a tough place to be at the time because every kind of natural disaster is going on at this point. It is said that over the next few years, Dogen visits 13 different places offered to him by various patrons. They want him to come and teach. They want him to come and run the temple. They want him to come and take care of practice. None of these was right for the kind of practice he wants to do. So he's trying to find a place to settle, and he can't quite find the place to settle. So by 1233, he's developed a small practice place called Kanondori, and he later expands this temple into Kosho Horinji, officially called Koshoji, in 1236. We mostly know it today as Koshoji. So it's the first Chinese-style temple in Kyoto. It has the first Dharma hall and the first monks' hall in Japan, and we're going to see that's significant. That's a significant shift. So we see him trying to share the things that he learned in China. He's trying to get this thing established, but he's having a hard time gaining a following, getting support, gaining practitioners. So in 1241, he's joined by a group of Zen practitioners known as the Darumashu, or the lineage of Bodhidharma. Daruma, right? Darumashu, lineage of Bodhidharma. It begins as a branch of Rinzai, then it enters into a fairly severe conflict with both Tendai and Rinzai, and this group sort of takes refuge with Dogen's Sangha, with Dogen's practitioners. So several of the folks that come to him in this way will go on to be key players in Soto Zen history. We're going to hear more about them. So Koun Eijo, we all know about Koun Eijo, becomes Dogen's successor. Edits a lot of his writing, a lot of Dogen's writing later on. We have Gikai, Gien, and Gi-in. We'll be hearing from them again when we get to the Sandai Soron, or the third generation split. So Gikai, Gien, Gi-in come into the story again later on. So Dogen has some fairly fundamental differences with Darumashu, as we'll see. Eijo was a wholehearted convert to Dogen's teaching and Dogen's approach, but others were sort of ambivalent, weren't so anxious to give up their affiliation with Darumashu. We see in Dogen's writings he's continuing to react to, respond to, contradict Darumashu teachings, because now he's got these folks in his Sangha, so now he's kind of got to retrain them, right? So he's bumping up against this, even in his own temple with the students that are coming to him. So in any event, by now, Dogen is practicing with about 50 monks. It is said that he gave precepts to 2,000 people. So he's got at least somebody paying some attention to him. This is not 2,000 monks, this is 2,000 people, because precepts were being given to lay people too. So after Dogen has been at Koshoji for about 10 years, he finally has the patronage of an important samurai called Hatano Yoshishige. And Dogen had presented or talked about the material of his Zenki fascicle, the fascicle of his Shobogenzo called Zenki, which is not, Shobogenzo is not a thing yet, but he's giving these teachings at this guy's estate, right? At Hatano's estate. So Dogen goes there, gives a talk, talks about Zenki. Hatano offers to relocate Dogen's community to his own estates. He's got some land at a place called Echizen province, which is far to the north. So there's still this ongoing tension with the Tendai community. There's the growing competition with the Rinzai school. The Fujiwaras are objecting to Dogen's teaching and his approach to practice, and generally a number of things that are happening. They're not entirely clear. According to Soto Shu, the reason Dogen leaves and goes to the north is his teacher's dying words, which are supposed to be, "Do not live among the crowds of a town, but rather stay in a glen deep in the mountains, receiving very few people, and work to continue our true teachings." So supposedly this is the last thing Dogen's teacher says to him. But that's only one explanation for why he leaves and goes to the north. It may not be historically the best one. It could have been that he was in dispute with other teachers or with government officials, nobility. He could have been that he just wants to make a complete break with all the systems that he's a part of. He could have been completely disillusioned by all the systems that like he was caught up in. We don't really know. We may never know. That's still kind of an open question. Why does he leave and go to the north when this patron offers him this land? So that's the third period. The fourth period is the performative period. So this is the last roughly 10 years of Dogen's life. So he achieves his plan of leading a genuinely reclusive sort of temple at Eiheiji. He remains focused on Zazen and the ritual that he brought back from China. Recall the tension of being popular in the world and being secluded and focused on the practice you aspire to do. Like, how do we carry both of those things? So at this point, Dogen says that anyone who really wants to practice with him will come to him wherever he is, and that bringing his teachings and practice outward to people who might not be ready might just be his own selfish attempt to gain support. He's kind of looking at his own motivation and looking at his own aspirations. Says, what do I do? Do I do this secluded thing, and sort of keep the teachings pure, or do I need to take these out into the world? Maybe people aren't ready for this yet. Maybe this isn't a worthwhile use of my time. So he's kind of ambivalent. He's kind of wondering, like, what do I do now? So that's the landscape of this last period of his life. So in 1243, he moves his whole assembly to Echizen, which is pretty remote. has the advantage of some really terrific scenery and landscapes. Had we all been together in person, I would have brought in my book of Echizen photographs. You could have seen what the place looks like. So big mountains, big trees, lovely place. So his followers build a practice center there, and they call it Sanshoho Daibutsu. And the following year, they install their Buddha statue, and they have their first Ango, their first practice period. So they're making progress. They've got a building, they've got a Buddha, they do Ango, they're underway. So in 1246, Dogen renames this temple Eheji. So it's common for the abbot to use the name of his temple as his own name. When I was training at Toshoji, Soto Roshi would make a phone call, pick up the phone and say, Toshoji desu, this is Toshoji. He would use that name for himself, right? So Dogen's temple at this time is called Daibutsuji, or Great Buddha Temple. So imagine the difficulties if you're taking your temple name as your name to go around calling yourself Great Buddha. Hello, Great Buddha here. Might be a problem. So maybe he's rethinking this, and that might be what triggered the renaming of Daibutsuji to Eheji, right? Eternal peace. Because if you're going around calling yourself Great Buddha and you've already got an arrogance problem, maybe that's difficult. I don't know. So again, Eheji in Japanese means eternal peace. It sounds like a lovely concept. It sounds like a very nice name. It has some additional meaning because it's also connected with the Yongping era in China, which is when Buddhism first arrived there. So he's hearkening back to Buddhism's arrival in China, the same as he believes he's bringing the original Buddhism to Japan, back to Japan. So in 1247, the newly installed shogun's regent, another of the Hojos, Hojo Tokiyori, invites Dogen to come to Kamakura and to teach him. So Hojo is in effect the head of the government, right? If he's the regent, he's the head of the government. So this is an important connection for Dogen, who's trying to make his way. So Dogen makes this long trip to give this guy lay precepts. He ends up staying there for 6 months. It was the only time he left Eheji until his final illness. So all the rest of the time, he's there at Eheji with his monks, with his practitioners. He leaves for 6 months to give lay precepts and to sort of investigate that situation, see what that was about. So Dogen gave precepts to a lot of people. Hojo gave him the chance to stay and establish a new temple there, but Dogen in the end says, nope, I'm not going to do it. He declines that offer. He goes back to Eheji in 1248. He gave 10 poems to this regent's wife, but that's really the only writing of his that we have from this time. So he's on the road for those 6 months. He's not doing writing. He's not working on the Shobogenzo. He's not turning out new things. He's just written these 10 poems for the wife of this regent. So it seems that he was kind of disappointed that he didn't really have more chances to dig into the Dharma with people while he was there. We don't really know what else he was doing while he was there, but it seems like he wasn't doing a lot of intensive teaching or intensive practice while he was there. So a few years later, then this regent, Hojo, steps down to join the Rinzai school. So we don't know what happened there. He spent all this time with Dogen. He ends up going to Rinzai. It's kind of a mystery. So overall at Eheji, Dogen is emphasizing discipline, especially the kind of daily chores that you do in a temple or perhaps even at your house, but these kind of daily tasks for daily upkeep based on dignified daily demeanor, which he saw as linked to a deep understanding of sort of the universal impact of karmic causality. So we're going to talk a lot later about dignified deportment is the Buddha Dharma. That was one of his main themes. So there seems to be a difference from what he's doing at Koshoji, where his emphasis is mainly Zazen. There is more inclusiveness there for women and for laity. By the time he gets to Eheji, there's been something of a shift. He's very interested now in how we do forms and our demeanor and our behavior and our discipline and that piece of that monastic container. So in the autumn of 1252, Dogen falls ill. It's pretty clear that he's not going to recover. He's becoming worse and worse. So he gives his robes to Konejo, his main apprentice, his main student, and he makes him the abbot of Eheji. So he's handed off his temple to his main student. Then he goes with Ejo to Kyoto looking for medical treatment. They're hoping there's something that can be done. That treatment proved ineffective. So while he was staying at the home of a layman, he dies. He passes away in 1253 at the age of 53. He's said to have died in zazen posture. Perhaps another story. If earlier we saw he didn't sleep for 2 years lying down because he was sleeping in zazen posture, it makes sense that he would also die in zazen posture. So his coffin is taken back to Kinninji. It goes from there to the cremation site. His funeral was fairly simple, possibly because he had died away from Eiheiji and away from his community. At the cremation, Ejo chanted the Sharidaimon. We still chant the Sharidaimon today at grave sites when we put ashes in. In Japan, when we would do a funeral and we would finally bring the ashes to the site, Sharidaimon was what we chanted, so we're still doing that. But that's really about all we know. So there's some gaps in the story, and there's some things we may never know, right? So that's what we know or think we know about Dogen's life story. There is a lot more to the story than that. There is a legacy of miraculous happenings during his lifetime that start to create the brand, if you will. So during his life and after his life, miraculous stories of the things he can do, the powers that he has. And in addition to the miracle tales and that whole thing, there is also the piece of his story about how he sort of falls into obscurity after he dies, and he's not rediscovered for several centuries. So how that all happened shaped the way we see Dogen today, and to some degree shaped the way we practice. So miracle tales in the Buddhist tradition are often designed to show how powerful a teacher is, or how powerful a temple is. Sometimes it's about increasing legitimacy against other traditions that may be around. Sometimes it's to increase your connections with the laity and increase donations from laity. So when we get to genres of writing, we'll look a little more closely at miracle tales kind of as a genre. As we saw, there are several kinds of Buddhist groups and Buddhist sects arising during the Kamakura. They're all competing for attention in some way. So being able to tell miraculous stories about Dogen helps to confirm his legacy and his legitimacy, and to establish Eiheiji as an important center of practice. So auspicious signs were said to mean that Eiheiji was the only place in Japan where the Dharma had been transmitted correctly, and that made it an important temple and a powerful temple. So, if Dogen's mission is bring, authentic, correctly transmitted Buddhism to Japan, and the stories and the auspicious signs make Eiheiji that place, it certainly lends some legitimacy, right? It certainly builds the brand and creates the image that they wanted to create. So Menzan Zuiho was a 17th century reformer within what was now Soto Zen. We'll spend some time with him shortly. He makes good use of these miracle tales in order to establish Dogen's teaching as the sole reference for Soto Zen practice. So Dogen's teachings become the main reference point for how do we actually practice. So in his biography of Dogen, which was written in 1753, there's a story of Dogen becoming very sick while he's traveling in China. He's traveling with another monk named Dosho, and the story goes, Dogen fell gravely ill on his way back from China, but had no medicines that could be of use. Suddenly, an immortal appeared and gave Dogen an herbal pill, after which he immediately became better. The master asked this deity to reveal its identity. The mysterious figure replied, I am the Japanese kami Inari, and disappeared. Medicine became known as Geidokugan, which has ever since been part of the Dosho family heritage. Dogen then told Dosho that this rare and wondrous medicine had been bestowed on him by a true kami for the protection of the great Dharma, and that this medicine of many benefits should be distributed to temples so that they might spread the Dharma heritage. Well, Soto Zen establishment starts to manufacture this medicine because this is a good thing. They call it the poison dispelling pill. And this went on until the Meiji era. So, it was commonly sold nationwide as an herbal medicine. So it was a good source of income for Soto Zen. So of course, if you want to protect your income stream, you're going to tell miraculous stories about how this medicine came to your denomination. You're the only ones that have it, and it's miraculously powerful, and it came straight from Dogen. So these kinds of stories become important. There's a statue at the pond at Eiheiji that tells another miracle story about Dogen, as well as a 14th century painting, supposedly commissioned by Dogen, has his calligraphy on it. So the story says that when he was returning to Japan from China, the ship that he was on got caught in a storm, And the storm got so bad that the crew was convinced that this ship was going to sink and they were all going to die. So Dogen leads everybody in chanting to Avalokiteshvara. She appears to him and a few other people. The storm begins to subside and everybody agrees that they've been saved due to her intervention because she was appealed to by Dogen. So another story says that on his way from his temple to the port to board the ship to go back, he's encountered a tiger, and he emerges from that encounter unscathed because he sits up in a tree and uses his powers of Zazen. Right? So you can see kind of how these stories get developed. There's another story that says Dogen was doing a ceremony at Echizen for the 16 Arhats. They all appeared before him in a multicolored cloud. So the statues of the Arhats in the Dharma Hall all start emitting rays of light, and Dogen then exclaims that he takes it as an auspicious sign that the offerings that he has made are accepted, and the Arhats are protecting the people in the Dharma and the mountain that they're on. So somehow Dogen's personal spiritual power has brought the Arhats. They've arrived on a cloud. Even their statues are emitting rays of light. He's found favor with the Arhats, and they're now protecting the temple and all the people, and in fact, the entire mountain. So various other non-human beings showed up, apparently, at various times when Dogen was leading practice or doing practice. There was a deva, I guess, that came to observe Ryakusatsu when they did that at Koshoji. There was a dragon that visited Dogen at Eheji and asked for the precepts. Can we give the precepts to a dragon? I don't know. Probably the best known story about Dogen is that he spent his last night in China copying the Blue Cliff Record. So he's getting ready to leave China. He's been there for 4 years. He's going home to Japan. He comes across the Blue Cliff Record for the very first time. He stays up all night making a handwritten copy of this book. So this book is actually way too big for anybody to copy it in one night. He didn't have enough time. So the story goes that during the night, the god of the great sacred mountain of Hakusan appears and helps Dogen to finish making his copying the text. So the hand-copied manuscript, which is known as the One Night Blue Cliff Record, is housed at Daidoji in Kanazawa. So apparently there is an actual physical book known as the One Night Blue Cliff Record. And Dogen is credited with introducing the Blue Cliff Record to Japan through that story. So there are many, many, many such miraculous tales of Dogen floating around. Stories like these create this image of Dogen as a very special person with particular powers and particular abilities, and that's what you want if you're trying to establish your lineage as legitimate carriers of the tradition, and position your founders' teachings as the most authoritative teachings, right? The most correct, the most powerful teachings. So we'll talk more about this when we talk about medieval Asian Buddhist lit, traditions of the biographies of eminent monks. All those things are interconnected with miracle tales about Dogen. So, gotta move. Okay, so as we've seen, Dogen is succeeded by his disciple, Kon Ejo. Ejo believed in trying to keep to the central beliefs and practices of Zen, so he was resistant to bringing in elements of other traditions. There's always some felt need, some felt desire to be a little bit syncretic and to try to bring in more kinds of things to appeal to more people. Ejo really wants to keep to the central ideas, the core. He's followed by Tetsu Gikai and something called the Sandai Soron, or the third generation differentiation, sometimes called the third generation split. So you can read lots about the Sandai Soron. We don't have time to go into all of the details here. After Dogen's death, his group sort of loses focus. Some internal conflicts start to spring up, and it leads to a fracture. It leads to a split. So Ejo and Gikai go back and forth as abbot of Eheji. Dogen had liked Gikai, but Gikai wanted to introduce some esoteric elements, like sort of mystical prayers, incantations. He wants to add these things into the practice. Dogen's not so sure. By 1280, Ejo has died. Gikai is back in power at Eheji. He has the support of the military for the magical practices that protect the state, because you'll remember this morning we were talking about there are lots of sort of esoteric rites and rituals and ceremonies for the protection of the family, the state, the emperor. So ultimately, Gikai is forced out. He goes into exile. Gien takes over, and his followers claim that he is Eijo's real successor, not Gikai. Eijo hadn't really clearly designated a successor. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So third generation differentiation, right? There's some sort of infighting, some unsteadiness, back and forth about who has power there. So if you're interested in Sandai Soron, as I say, you can certainly look that up. Somebody who knows how to spell it can put it in the chat for you. There's plenty of scholarship about that. Okay, so there are three main early biographies of Dogen that we should know about, all written more than 100 years after his death. This is the sort of next wave of the Dogen brand. So the first major biography of Dogen is included as a chapter in the Transmission of Light, or the Denkoroku. You may be familiar with that book, which was originally a series of lectures by Keizan Jokin. The lectures were presented during the summer retreat at Daijoji, and they also contain sections dealing with 51 other patriarchs of Zen, or ancestors of Zen, including Tendo Nyojo and Eijo. So these are the transmission stories of the ancestors going back. So this book was lost for hundreds of years before being rediscovered and published officially by Soto Shu in 1885. So relatively recent in the world of Soto Shu. So the story about Dogen covers his early years, covers his experience in China, includes his viewing those 5 transmission documents, which we'll talk about shortly. But it primarily focuses on the episode about his awakening experience, as all of these stories do. So his awakening experience is verified in a private meeting with his teacher. He's certified at that point. His awakening is certified. So Denkoroku is a combination or a compilation of awakening stories. So it makes sense that that's the piece of Dogen's life that this is really kind of focusing on. Okay. Then there is a very sectarian biography in the record of Kensei. So Kensei is the 14th abbot of Eiheiji. So again, this time has gone by. We're now down to the 14th abbot. So this thing is first published in 1472. It's apparently written by Kensei 20 years earlier for the 250th anniversary of Dogen's death. So one of the things we're going to notice is when there's a death anniversary, something gets published, something gets revised, something happens in honor of that anniversary. So this biography was apparently written for the 250th anniversary of Dogen's death. So these days, we know there are several versions of the record of Kensei. They often differed quite a lot. There was quite a bit of difference in content, in emphasis. Different versions were stored in different places, various different Soto temples. So finally, there is a standard edition that's produced in 1752 to mark the 500th anniversary of Dogen's death, when the core text was significantly expanded, and it becomes the annotated record of Kensei. So we have the record of Kensei, we've added material, now it's the annotated record of Kensei. And as we'll see shortly, this was a Reformation project with a very particular kind of agenda. So this new version includes a number of unlikely Dogen miracle tales, and this is where a lot of these Dogen stories come from. We can trace them back to this version of the biography. So then in 1803, we've got the 550th death anniversary. So we have an updated version of the same piece, and now it's called the Illustrated Annotated Record of Kensei, right? We just keep adding something in there and then making the title a little bit longer. So this one includes illustrations showing about 60 scenes of Dogen's life, highlighting many of these miracle tale episodes. The illustrations are originally black and white, but eventually they get colorized, because this is what we do. They get colorized for publications that are produced during the 2003 celebrations of the 750th death anniversary. So we can see this thing, right? Just sort of having its own life as it's going along the timeline. So we have these 3 biographies. And one would think, great, we've got biographies of Dogen. Well, they are not necessarily the best sources of factual information on Dogen's life, right? The problem is they've been around so long. They were created and promoted by the sect itself. Even modern scholarship has been influenced by these things. So we're only just now starting to look critically at what we really know about Dogen's life. There are some questions, there are some gaps, there are some things we're probably never going to be able to resolve. So certainly when we encounter a miracle tale that seems unlikely, probably we go, that's a miracle tale with a very specific kind of purpose. But, you know, as we've seen, the biographies are written long after he dies. Things are added, things are appended, things are moved around, and there's a reason for wanting to do these things. It's a death anniversary. We want to raise visibility. We want to increase credibility. We want to call Dogen to mind again. We're going to make that story as appealing as we possibly can. So we have to be a little bit careful these days about, you know, what we assume we know about Dogen's life. Okay, so now let's put ourselves into the Tokugawa, or the Edo period, which is 1603 to 1867. And at this point, Soto Zen, as a denomination, has more than 17,500 temples. And they are grouped into networks that are identified with particular prominent lineages. So the shogunate orders that temples in the lineage of Giin and Meiho Sotetsu are going to affiliate with Eiheiji, and that was about 1,300 temples. So of 17,500 temples, 1,300 of them are ordered to affiliate with Eiheiji. And the remaining 16,200 temples go to Sojiji. So today, Eiheiji has only 148, and most of those are minor temples in the north. So most Soto temples these days are not affiliated with Eiheiji. And, you know, Dogen's temple, as Dogen's temple, Eiheiji is a bit of a figurehead. So Sojiji is the other head temple, right? So today we have two head temples. We have Sojiji, we have Eiheiji. Most temples are not affiliated with Eiheiji. They're Sojiji places, which is kind of interesting when you consider kind of where all of this started. So we will talk about temple lineage versus Dharma lineage in a little bit, but Sotoshu sometimes says that Eiheiji is the head of Dharma lineages and Sojiji is the head of temple lineages. So two kinds of lineage, in charge of a particular kind of lineage. So Eiheiji is positioned as the holder or embodiment or something of our collective memory of Dogen. Our spiritual authority, you know, is inherited from him, even if our temples aren't actually branch temples of Eiheiji. So even if we're Sojiji temples, our spiritual authority, all right, our collective memory, the things that, the pieces of that that are important are still coming to us, even though we're not directly affiliated. So clearly it's been important for Eiheiji to manage Dogen's image, to manage his memory as the source of its own legitimacy. So its strategies have included lots of things like getting the endorsement and the patronage of the royal court. So, you know, if you have the blessing of the emperor and the court, of course, that raises your status, raises your legitimacy. It also required attendance at larger and larger Dogen memorial services. And as we've seen, every so often, it's time to do a memorial service, a death anniversary. So attendance is required at these things. So Eiheiji organizes celebrations of Dogen's birth, including, by the way, setting the January 26th date. We don't actually know when Dogen was born, but January 26th is the date that we observe. Also organizing large occasions of giving lay precepts. So cementing ties with the laity and bringing them in, making that connection, connecting them with Buddha by giving precepts to large quantities of lay people. So apparently the first modern occasion of giving lay precepts was 1899, so it hasn't been that long. So men and women were invited, lay men and women were invited for 7 days of ceremonies and sermons and the actual Jukai ceremony itself, and it became kind of an annual thing after that. So this year, you may know, we're doing the 100th anniversary of Soto Zen in North America, and what are we doing? A big precepts ceremony. We're doing a big Jukai in November. So that tradition kind of goes on. So they're making the case that only Eiheiji maintained the traditional practices that Dogen advocated. So, you know, Eiheiji is the one and only holder of these very traditional things that Dogen did. They're the holder of his memory, the holder of his practice, right? That's the seat of our collective memory of Dogen. So Eiheiji is putting its name, or its brand, if you will, on publications of Dogen's writings. It's encouraging Dogen's scholarship, both by publishing his biography as they created it, as they see it, and by promoting study of the Shobogenzo, which was not well known for a very long time. Apparently the first annual Genzo-e was 1905, so again, hasn't been that long. It was aimed really at academics and popular writers and laity and monks. And, you know, although back in the day, nobody knew about Shobogenzo, nobody was studying the Shobogenzo, there's an academic today who says, and today every Soto Zen teacher lectures on Dogen's Shobogenzo. So somehow Shobogenzo has arrived, has made its mark. So this Reformation effort had two major objectives. One was to reform the institutions of Soto Zen. The other was to clarify the basis of its doctrines. So we have the institutions, the external, and we have the doctrines or the teachings, right? So Manzan Dohaku and his student Menzan Zuiho, who I mentioned a minute ago, and others started working on gathering and organizing and putting together everything about Dogen, gathering up his story, putting together all of his writings, collecting, comparing, editing his manuscripts, evaluating materials for the biography that then came out, and they're also writing commentaries on Dogen's works. So Menzan in particular is concerned about what he saw as deviations from Dogen's teaching. He was convinced that important stuff was getting lost, either lost like forgotten about or lost like shifted, all right? So he's very, very concerned that somehow we've lost the spirit, you know, we've lost the purity of what Dogen was doing. He said that only Soto was preserving the teaching that Zazen itself is the treasury of the true Dharma I, right? Shobogenzo means the treasury of the true Dharma I. So, of course, this is a dig at Rinzai, right? He says, well, Soto is the only one that really knows what Zazen is about because, you know, we're the only ones who have preserved Zazen as the true treasury of the true Dharma I and the mystic mind of nirvana. So he said that only Tendo Nyojo had preserved and taught it in China, and only Dogen had gotten it from Tendo Nyojo and brought it forward. So there was supposed to be a very direct link, and this was handed from master to student to master to student to master to student. So in later generations, he says, too many Soto monks have gone off to train at the various important Kamakura temples, which of course are not all Zen. We've seen many, many kinds of temples. He says some of them have drifted over into Rinzai practice. They've lost the Dharma of their own house. Somehow they've fallen off the path. They've wandered away. So Menzan says there are lots and lots of practices going by the name of Zazen, but this is not what Dogen taught. This was not what Dogen ever had in mind. He says these things are Taoist or Confucian or Shinto or contemplation of sutras or just stuff people are making up. He didn't have a lot of patience for that. He says Dogen Zazen is unique because it's about non-thinking, and we will talk about non-thinking, right? So beyond thinking and not thinking is non-thinking. So he says Dogen Zazen is unique because it's about non-thinking. So it's not a psychological exercise. It was not like Rinzai koan practice. It didn't have any expectations about achieving enlightenment. It is a direct expression of reality. He says that's what makes it unique. That's what makes it, you know, kind of its own practice. So this is the start of establishing Soto Zen orthodoxy and enshrining Dogen as the ultimate authority on that orthodoxy. So in 1615, the Bakufu, or the shogunate, declared that Eiheiji standards must be the rule for all Soto monks. So of course, this is a dream come true, right? Eiheiji is now the sole protector, the only holder of Dogen's rules. So Eiheiji standards must now be the rule for all Soto monks. So in time, this comes to mean that all the writings of Dogen are the rules. So all Soto doctrines and organizations are based on Dogen's writings. And that's the only guideline, right? That's the only legitimate guideline. Did Dogen write it? Okay, that's where we look for our rules. So it also means then that his texts become the authority, rather than the practice handed down from a live person to a live person to a live person being the authority. Now it's the texts that are the authority, right? So if something is written in the text and we're practicing it today differently, it's the text that wins, not what you learned from your teacher, which is kind of interesting, right? So there's an even greater emphasis on studying Dogen when Menzan comes along 80 or 90 years later. He wrote more than 100 works, including many, many commentaries on Dogen's writings. He promoted reforms of monastic regulations and practice based on his readings, his understanding of what Dogen wrote. So these guys are looking for the basis of Soto doctrine. They're establishing, where does our teachings come from? Where do our practices come from? Like, where do we go? What's the source? What's the origin? Where do we look when we're afraid deviation is happening? What do we go back to? So they're very much establishing Dogen's writings as the center of the universe when it comes to all of those questions. So Menzan singles out the Fukanza Zengi as important, writes a commentary on it, which sparked other commentaries. And as we know, Fukanza Zengi is still widely read today. It's still a very, very important text for us. I think for some of us, it may be the first Dogen thing we ever read. So this first thing that Dogen ever wrote becomes, for many of us, the first teaching that we have about Zazen. So an important element of the work of reforming these institutions has to do with succession. Succession becomes a big issue, kind of a big problem. So there are two kinds of dharma, if you will, in this circumstance. There's the Garanbo, the temple or the monastic dharma, and the Ninbo, which is the individual dharma. So Garan is the temple and Nin is a person. So we have Garanbo, which is the temple or monastic dharma. We have Ninbo, which is the individual dharma. So your place in the institution was determined by Garanbo, temple dharma. If you're in charge of one temple, you move to another temple, you drop your current lineage, and you adopt the lineage of the new temple. So that allowed you to claim descent from more than one lineage. And to change your lineage, every time you change temples, you would change your lineage. So you're holding multiple kinds of lineages, right? It gets very confusing, right? So you're at one temple, you're in charge of the temple, that's your lineage. You take over another temple, you change your lineage. Doesn't matter who transmitted you, right? You take on temple lineage. So Menzan says, this is all wrong. He says, this is not okay. Real transmission is what you get from the Buddha through your teacher. So he creates a set of arguments for changing the rules for Dharma transmission based on his understanding of Dogen's writings. He needs an indisputable authority because he gets a whole lot of pushback on this. There are people who, it's a real advantage for them to hold multiple lineages, to change when they pick up a new temple. There are people who are working the system. They're not so happy about reforming that thing. So he's getting some pushback, and he needs to have a source, an unimpeachable source. So in the course of the debate, Menzan and Menzan are pushed into an even more radical position, that Dharma transmission did not depend on the state of mind of the recipient, but only on the formal certification by a teacher. So it doesn't matter what's going on with you. Your teacher certifies you, you're good. So once you were transmitted, then your lineage was fixed. You could not have two official teachers. You could not be transmitted in more than one lineage. And today, this is still the official Soto position. So if you change your teacher, if you're ordained as a novice, you can change your teacher and change your teacher. But once you're transmitted, everyone knows you're done. You can't change anything anymore. So you better decide before you get that final transmission. So there is a doctrinal basis for this, which we'll see when we get to major themes of Dogen's writings. We talk about authentic transmission and all of that. But it was also a useful position at a time when Soto was competing with Rinzai and all those other traditions, and people are moving back and forth from one sect to another, from one temple to another, one teacher, one school to another. If you were transmitted now in the Soto tradition, that's all you were, and that's all you could be. You couldn't claim to be transmitting the Dharma of more than one teacher or more than one sect, right? So we start to see institutions forming and things really kind of solidifying. So the reform continues into the 18th century with Gento Sokchu. He's the 11th abbot of Eiheiji. His contribution is in de-emphasizing the use of koans, which historically, of course, had been widely practiced, even in Soto Zen. We have this idea that there's no place for koans in Soto Zen. It's historically not true. So the use of koans is another key point of Dogen's teaching, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We're going to come back to that. Gento starts the elevation of Dogen to the status that he has nowadays, right, where he implemented new regulations based on what he perceived that Dogen had done in his own temples. So Gento is working on monastic regulations. How do we function as a temple community? So we can see this pulling in toward whatever we think it was that Dogen taught, whether that's about teachings, doctrine, transmission, how do we run a temple, how do we practice. There's this pulling in toward whatever your perception is today of what Dogen taught over the course of many years, right? So we have the beginning of the creation of the systems and the structures that we see today in our practice and in our denomination. So with everybody combing through the Shobogenzo, looking for ammunition for whatever position it was that they wanted to take, looking for something that's going to back up the kind of changes they want to make and the reforms that they wanted to do, Soto Shu gets worried, right? So denominational authorities start to get worried because people could use Dogen's writings for whatever the heck they wanted. You could twist them, take them out of context, whatever, find another version that you liked better. You could use Dogen to back you up on anything you wanted to do. And of course, that's a dangerous thing, right? People are afraid of change. That's a dangerous thing anyway. So goodness knows, Shobogenzo is open to interpretation. You could make that say kind of whatever you want to do. So Soto Shu asks the government to restrict the copying and the publication of any part of Shobogenzo in 1722. Just stops it. So again, time goes by. Now we're at the Meiji Restoration, so 1868, 1912. This is where we see Japan abandoning the feudal system that I outlined this morning, begins opening to the West, begins absorbing Western ideas, modernist ideas. It's not a great time for Buddhism because Shinto is the state religion. So Buddhism tries to adapt in order to survive. It's kind of getting pushed away, pushed out. So Buddhism does some things that we look back on today and we think might be questionable, including endorsing Japanese nationalism during the wars that are happening at the time. It's trying to survive. So we often say here that Uchiyama Roshi's main life question was, how do we balance peace and progress? You've probably heard us talk about that. Opening the hand of thought is all about that. And this is kind of where this begins. So for Buddhism, all this Western influence is threatening. It tries to modernize Zen in accordance with those influences in order to stay current, stay relevant, stay on the good side of people whose patronage and power and approval it needs. So at the same time, it needs to maintain and protect a Japanese identity in the world. So if these practices and the denomination and the people become terribly westernized, then they're out of sync also. So like, how do we balance these two things? So for Uchiyama Roshi, peace is the traditional, serene Japanese approach to life. Things move slowly, more heavily influenced by like cycles of nature, right? So nothing's going along at a galloping pace. Modernizing is not happening at a galloping pace. Progress is the scientific and the technological and the industrial advances that are coming in from the West. These are not entirely evil, but they're scary. They're new, they're different, they create some upheaval. So for Uchiyama Roshi, it's how do we balance this traditional Japanese cultural serenity and the fact that all of this stuff is coming in, all of this innovation is coming in. So during this period, folks start reappraising Dogen. They use his brand, if you will, to make sure that Eiheiji is at the center of the organization, to create closer ties with laity. The first, as I say, the first modern Jukai happened at Eiheiji, 1899. Eiheiji promotes Dogen study, again, particularly the Shobogenzo. So overall, an image of Dogen gets constructed that serves Eiheiji's interests, right? It's in Eiheiji's interest to have a particular image for the founder. So it brings in financial support that helps just with the upkeep of the place. It attracts monks and lay people to study there, people who feel inspired by Dogen, by what he wrote, by what we think we know about his story. Most importantly, it shores up Eiheiji as Dogen's place, right, in this competition and this rivalry with Sojiji, the other head temple. So, as long as Dogen has a powerful image, Eiheiji's place is secure in that rivalry with its sister temple, Sojiji. So we mentioned Keizan Zenji a bit this morning. We don't have a lot of time to talk about him, but as I mentioned, he's considered sort of the second patriarch or the second ancestor of Soto Zen. He focused on sort of spreading the denomination's influence in the world rather than practicing only in the training temple. So this is kind of the next wave, the next step, right? So by 1589, Imperial Court recognizes Sojiji as the head temple of the Soto school, above Eiheiji. So these two are still jockeying for position. 1589, Sojiji comes out on top. So remember that in 1615, the shogun has said Eiheiji rules are the house rules for all of Soto. So that piece is a victory over Sojiji. So these two temples remain rivals for the support of the emperor, and by the time of the Meiji Restoration, they've kind of arrived at a truce. They've each been given something. They've each got a certain sphere of influence, and they've, sort of come to terms with that. So everyone agrees that the Soto school follows the maxims of the founding patriarch Dogen and the aspirations of the late teacher Keizan. Keizan is associated with Sojiji. So we have these two influential founders, right? These two ancestors. We've got the maxims of Dogen and the aspirations of Keizan. So we've got the maxims of Dogen at Eiheiji, we have the aspirations of Keizan at Sojiji, and somehow these two have figured out how to get along. So it is really important, as we see, to understand that the image we have today of Dogen is something that's been quite intentionally constructed for some very specific purposes. It is not straight historical reportage. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we think we know that may or may not be accurate. It's not uncommon for these things in the world of Asian religion and Asian literature. Of course, it's not unheard of in other cultures, other places, other times, other circumstances. But I think it's important to just know this is not considered unethical activity. We might look at this and go, well, somebody's distorting the picture for their own ends, and isn't that manipulation, and isn't that an unethical, unwholesome thing to do? It's not considered that way. All miracle tales were like this. There's lots and lots of miracle tales attached to lots and lots of temples. In some cases, the same story is told by multiple temples. Why? One temple heard it and said, that's a good promotional piece. We'll take that. This is not considered, unhealthy activity. This is simply the way things worked. So we have to be a little bit careful about putting a Western filter on that says, fake news, right? False advertising. Not the way this was seen. It's just the way systems grew. It's just the way things grew. Okay, I want to mention briefly the commentaries. There are several important commentaries. We don't have to memorize these things, but we should probably be aware that they exist because they too are very influential in our Dogen study. So the first one is the Gosho. Two major early commentators on Dogen's work were two guys by the name of Sennei and Kyogo. And Sennei was Dogen's actual direct student, and Kyogo was Sennei's student, but Kyogo also studied with Dogen. So these three had practiced together and studied together. So Kyogo compiles two commentaries on the 75 fascicle version of the Shobogenzo, and collectively, these two commentaries are called Go Kiki Gaki Sho. Go Kiki Gaki Sho, which is usually abbreviated Gosho. You're more likely to see Gosho. So it seems that Kyogo wrote the first commentary, finished it in 1308, right? So Dogen dies in 1253. This commentary is coming at 1308. That's the first commentary. The second one seems to have been written by his teacher, Sennei, in 1263, and sort of appended to this first one, stuck onto this first one after Sennei died. So Sennei writes this thing. He's already gone. His work is appended to this other commentary, and these two things kind of become connected. So these commentaries were fairly unknown during the lifetimes of these two guys who wrote them, but ultimately they become very, very important in defining modern Soto Zen doctrine. Certainly, they were consulted during the Reformation to try to make sense of Dogen's teachings, right? If these are now the house rules, boy, we really need to know what's going on. These commentaries are one of the resources. This is one of the things that gets consulted. So the current understanding of the Shobogenzo and other aspects of Dogen's approach to doctrine and practice are heavily influenced by these commentaries through this reform period, and perhaps even after. So that's Gosho is one important one. Next commentary is Benchu. It's written something like 1726, 1729. So this commentary is part of a controversy about whether or not the Shobogenzo actually is an authentic writing by Dogen. There was some question for a while as to whether the Shobogenzo was actually Dogen's writing. There were so many different versions of this thing, so many different chapter numbers, different numbers of fascicles, different language, different pieces floating around. People thought, we're not so sure. This Shobogenzo was actually Dogen's work. So a Soto scholar named Tenkei Denson did the first full-length, line-by-line study of the Shobogenzo since Kyogo's time. So he rejected actually 6 fascicles. He suggested changes to a lot of others, so he was in there doing some editing. thinking things needed to be changed or corrected. He edited out pieces he didn't agree with. This is what we do as human beings. He corrected Dogen's readings of Chinese passages by adding words or changing the punctuation. Well, as we know, sometimes, or as we'll find out, Dogen is sometimes very intentionally misreading these things. He's going along and correcting them. So Tenkei had two problems with the Shobogenzo. He didn't like the criticisms of famous Chinese teachers, and sometimes, Dogen will go off on a rant. Chinese teacher does something he doesn't agree with, he's not afraid to say so. Tenkei didn't like those criticisms of those famous Chinese teachers. He didn't like the ungrammatical reading of the Chinese texts. For him, the only way the Shobogenzo could be accepted as authoritative, as Dogen's actual work, was to develop a new way to understand Buddhist texts so that when Dogen was using these unusual expressions, they could be explained, they could be understood. So he figures out, we need to find a whole new way to read this thing. So Gosho comes to the rescue. That first commentary, the Gosho, comes to the rescue here. So Tenkei didn't like the Gosho any more than he liked the Shobogenzo, but it gave other scholars a way to explain what Dogen was doing. So out of this come two important views. One is Japanese Soto Zen practice has to be judged against Dogen's writings, and Dogen's teachings transcend any other understanding of Zen practice in Buddhism. So we really start to see how this is becoming centralized, how these house rules are really becoming the go-to. It's the origin, it's the source. Like if there's any question, where do we look? We go back to Dogen's writing. Even the practice has to be judged against the writings. So the writings are paramount, right? So Tenkei's commentary comes to be seen as a bit heretical. It was not universally widely loved. It was written in 1730, but it wasn't published until 1881. So it's floating around, not being published for a long time. During the Reformation, Menzon attacks Tenkei for not recognizing the importance of the Gosho, because of course he likes the Gosho, he's attached to it. There's another scholar called Banjin Dotan who bases his doctrine of Zen precepts largely on Kyogo's commentary. So Banjin then does his own commentary, Shobogenzo Ben Chu. So we have another commentary now. So Menzon was long supposed to have written the commentary Shobogenzo Monge, which was a detailed explanation of Dogen's teaching. Modern scholarship says it was actually written by his student, Fusan Gen Totsu. Menzon did write commentaries on several fascicles. He wrote one on the Bendowa, he wrote one on Genjo Koans, on Myozomai. So he was writing commentaries, but that particular one, Shobogenzo Monge, not actually written by Menzon, probably. Okay, next one is a commentary called, for short, Sanshu, or Sanbon. It has a very long name, and the writer of it is Katsudo Honko. So this is a 14-volume scholarly work in Chinese. So, right, this is quite dense and quite a thing to get through. It was written in 1712 and not published for 100 years. So, that big 14-volume version is out there as well in Chinese. And finally, there's one called the Shobogenzo Shiki by Zakkei Zokai, which is said to be a more accessible version of this 14-volume commentary. So, of course, we know those are not the only commentaries. Those are some important early ones. Commentarial tradition goes on right up to today. Nishi Ariboku-san, who was an important teacher for Kodo Sawaki, wrote a commentary called Shobogenzo Kei Teki, which is a series of transcribed lectures. His disciple transcribed his lectures on Shobogenzo, and that's become a commentary. And of course, we know Hojo-san continues this tradition even today by translating the Shobogenzo and explaining it to us and making it understandable for us in the modern West. So that timeline goes through today and keeps on going. So biographies, commentaries, background materials, as I say, nobody should be memorizing this stuff, but it's important to know that those things are there and that they themselves form part of our tradition, part of our understanding. So these things are maybe one step removed from Dogen's life, Dogen's practice, Dogen's teachings. In some cases, they are highly interpreted, even constructed, compiled, edited, right? But somehow those become the sources of our tradition. So again, we have to just maintain some awareness, I think, that what we know, what we think we know, The picture we have received has some wrinkles in it, right? It may not be direct reportage. So none of those things are bad. We just need to know. All right. So having been through commentaries, biographies, let's move to medieval Japanese aesthetics. So we're going to shift gears. So before we talk specifically about what's happening in Buddhist literature in Japan, we need some understanding of Japanese aesthetics. So one of the most important elements in Japanese aesthetics overall is overcoming dichotomy. This is not going to be new territory. We are all about non-duality, right? And it's not only Dogen's writing himself, it is an overall, it's an important element overall of Japanese aesthetics. So this is dichotomies between thinking and feeling, between body and mind, between self and other, human and nature, public and private, all the dichotomies that you can imagine. This wants to collapse them down. Also, there's no real distinction between art and religion and daily life. So we think about aesthetics and we think about art, we think about poetry, painting, ceramics, calligraphy, right? And we say, well, there's a distinct thing there called art, right? At this point, there's kind of no distinction between something we call art as a practice, something we call religion, and just the rest of life. These things are all just activities that are going on and being carried out. So the boundaries between these things are pretty permeable. So evoking a feeling is an important part of Japanese aesthetics, whether that's applied to poetry, painting, any kind of arts. It's what serves as a gateway for the reader or the viewer, some means of connecting with not only the person who created the piece and the piece itself, but just collapsing that separation. Feeling is a gateway to collapsing that separation. So again, these artworks are not straight reportage. They are not sort of an impersonal recording of facts. There's a high degree of feeling there. There's something interpretive there. So the emphasis is on the process, not on what's being created. So if you're making a tea bowl, if you're making a calligraphy, if you're painting a picture, the emphasis is on the process, on the activity, on the practice of that, not so much on the piece that comes out the other end. So it's the creation of things as a means of discovering true self, right? Or manifesting true self. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? We see why these things are all so connected with each other, enmeshed with each other. So it's about self-cultivation rather than self-expression from the point of view of the ego. So, we're not creating something in order to express something about the small self. We're creating in order to cultivate our ability to completely manifest. In our language, we would say completely manifest Buddha nature or completely manifest awakening. Also, there's a particular sense of time that goes with Japanese aesthetics. So things don't become obsolete. Things don't get old and sort of become useless. When they get old, they take on a particular kind of beauty as they age or as they degrade. Impermanence, again, a critical element of Japanese aesthetics. So if your bowl gets worn out, it has a chip in it, or you have something and the color fades a bit, or there's a ravel on the edge or something, that doesn't make that object useless or somehow less beautiful. There is a beauty in the aging, in the degrading. So the passage of time is not quite the same as we would normally see it. So again, I could do a whole course on all of these things, but a few key terms and ideas, things we need to be aware of. We might not get through all of them, but we can pick it up again tomorrow. So first one, I mentioned this morning, mono no aware is on your general outline, so you have the spelling of that. So again, something like the poignant beauty of things, appreciating this kind of sadness or loneliness that goes with impermanence. So it's an intersection of finite existence with this flow of experience and flow of change. What's in that intersection? There's something a bit poignant about that, right? So it's not only a recognition that everything is impermanent, it's seeing and appreciating the beauty of that impermanence. So it's not the same as just sort of becoming aware that everything is changing and being resigned to that. oh, well, everything is changing. Therefore, I need to resign myself to the fact this thing that I love is, not always going to be here. That's not the sense of this at all. The sense of this is that there is real beauty in seeing what's actually going on and appreciating that impermanence and appreciating that change over time and being able to kind of open the hand, right? So in a very brief nutshell, mono no aware. So the next one is wabi. Wabi is understated beauty. But the key here is like moderation. The key here is nothing extra. So when we say understated beauty, it's not about austerity. It's about not more than you need, right? So it's not about deprivation. It's about being content with what we have. It's about showing restraint. If we're talking about three poisonous mind, we're working with greed, working to let go of greed, right? So non-attachment. Dealing with greed is one of the three poisons. So the extension here is an appreciation also of emptiness. And this is emptiness in both the physical sense and in the Buddhist sense. So you go into a room and there's an alcove, and that alcove is not piled up with stuff. It's not covered head to toe with things. There is a lot of empty space in that alcove so that we can appreciate the few very carefully chosen things that are there. So, in terms of physical emptiness, there's an appreciation of that. And of course, also emptiness in the Buddhist sense. Things don't have a fixed and permanent nature. So all of that enters in. So of course, if we talk about wabi, we have to talk about sabi. So sabi is desolate beauty. Sabi is ordinariness and imperfection of things, again, particularly as they age, but not only as they age. So this is ordinariness that certainly has an affinity with thusness, things just as they are, without the need for ostentation, without the need for somebody's idea that this object is, the most perfect specimen of its kind. All of that not necessary. So things as they are rather than as things as they should be, because we know should is one of the basic building blocks of suffering, right? So because something is old, it connects us to the past. And also if it's made of natural materials, as older things may be, then there's the connection to the natural world. So all of this factors in with sabi. So you may know sabi is also the root of the word for loneliness. So this desolation, sabisha, or being lonely, sabishi, right? There's this kind of underlying feeling of that. So it also alludes to the life of the hermit or the life of the recluse who's out in the cave or in the hut somewhere out in nature. So again, another reference, another connection with nature. And the key thing is detachment. So whether that's detachment from society, detachment from civilization, detachment from the ego and self-clinging and everything that goes with that. Nature is just as it is because it doesn't need improvement by human beings. It just allows us to see thusness in a particular way. So unfortunately, wabi-sabi has become a sort of home decorating fad. In some ways, it's kind of lost its meaning for us. A lot of people think it just means rustic or shabby chic or something. So we need to investigate what Buddhist teachers like Dogen were doing when they were incorporating these kinds of aesthetics. We maybe need to help our sanghas understand. So if you're in a position to help others to understand and point out some of these aesthetics, that's good, because we hear a term like wabi-sabi, go, oh, I know what that means. If you're into Japandi as a decorating style, oh yeah, wabi-sabi. But there's actually something quite profound. There's actually something quite deep happening, and we can see that and feel that when we read Dogen's writing. I'm going to guess particularly poetry is poetry, but not only. Okay, so the last term here is yugen. So yugen is the mystery. Yugen is the thing that is difficult to discern. So this is the Sumie painting of the hut in the misty mountains, or the painting of the moon behind the clouds, things that are stark, things that are simple, usually without color, things that are silent. And in the midst of that, or along with that, there's this sense of grace, something that can only be manifested after a lot of practice, a lot of discipline, a lot of cultivation, right? So you see somebody who's been doing a practice, whatever that practice is, for a long time. There's a grace there, right? And it's very simple. Whatever they're doing is usually very simple. There's no wasted movement. It could be, you watch a bricklayer with a lot of experience. It could be anything. There's this sense of the mystery, which is something difficult to discern. So particularly this shows up in landscape painting and in acting. You may be familiar with a guy called Zeami, who wrote manuals for actors. Of course, no theater was what he was involved with. And it's really interesting to read those and think about all of that the way we think about practice, right? Many parallels, many similarities. So in general, East Asian culture favors elusiveness, with an A, elusiveness, over being explicit, over being complete. So it would rather allude to something than to give you the whole thing. So that requires a certain amount of imagination, right? To see or to fill in everything that's actually there but not being expressed. So just because it's not included in the expression doesn't mean things aren't there. So things like gardens that include borrowed views. You may have a very small garden, but you make sure you have a view of the mountain, even though that mountain might be many, many miles away. You include it. You are alluding to the fact that there's a mountain there, even though your small garden is this big. Sometimes we use rocks in a garden to symbolize water or mountains or something, right? So you have a small rock and a little gravel patch. The illusion is something else, in addition. So we see it in gardens, we see it in literature. Some texts will include a well-known word or two from some other text. It incorporates that whole other text by reference. So the reader would recognize that phrase or recognize that term or that image or something. Oh, he's including this poem or this other text, right? There's a lot of allusion. It's not just Dogen. That is broadly used throughout East Asian medieval lit. So things are expressed indirectly. Details get omitted. You are required as a reader, a viewer, a participant to make an intuitive leap. And the point is that if you do that, rather than having everything spelled out for you in a lot of detail, if you make the intuitive leap, then that scene is more vivid than what you would have experienced if you just read the description or seen like a photographic representation of something. The fact that you have to enter into it and engage with it and make the intuitive leap makes it more more vivid for you. So it's quite intentional. That method is quite intentional. So Yugen is related to Buddhist teachings about interdependence. If things are completely interpenetrated, then it's tough to know where one thing starts and another thing ends. We can't really distinguish things. No boundaries, no separation. So the meanings become indeterminate. Like, where does one thing stop and one thing start, and what does this mean in relation, right? It's all, we've collapsed the dichotomy. We've collapsed the separation. So in literature, a phrase like, it's snowing and raining, sounds like a description of sleet, like what we just had over the last couple of days. We think, well, it's a reference to a spring shower, or it's reference to cold weather. The rain is coming, the snow is coming, it's kind of a nasty, icky sleet. It's actually a reference to a rain shower when the cherry blossoms are falling from the trees in the spring. So it's snowing and raining. Rain is coming, it's knocking the cherry blossoms off the trees, that's the snow. So when we understand that as a reference, well, our senses can kind of imagine that. Everything that goes with spring and flowers and rain, and of course the cherry blossoms are always a symbol of impermanence, so it evokes this beauty of regretting that these flowers are being knocked to the ground, right? So all of these things come up. A simple phrase like it's snowing and raining can evoke this whole scene and all of the feeling that goes with that. So this is what Yugen is about. So it's the elusiveness that's important, something beyond the physical form. Something beyond the concrete details, it's beyond even a feeling that's described directly. There might even appear to be contradictions. And when we get to Dogen, goodness, we see contradictions. So it might seem that there's, two conflicting things that are being said. So reading this kind of writing makes us bring together intellect and experience and intuition to make all of those connections, to fill in the whole picture, to experience that whole picture for ourselves. So it's not about figuring out what the symbols mean, like cracking a code. I think sometimes we come at these things and we go, oh, well, if cherry blossoms always mean impermanence, then, this means this and this means this, and I've cracked the code and now I understand it. It's not that easy. There's something else going on there which is not being fully expressed, right? Fully laid out for us, okay? So there are those who argue that the particularly Japanese appreciation for impermanence comes in part from their climate. Japan is an island with a completely changeable climate. So there's no desert, there's no tundra, there's no ecosystem that remains relatively unchanged over time. There are 4 very distinct seasons, and they've also got volcanic eruptions and hurricanes and earthquakes, and their landscape is even changing all the time. So there's snow-covered mountains, there's tropical beaches, there's everything in between. So change is constant. And impermanence contributes to this sense of mystery, the sense of nothing to grasp, right? So if everything around you is very clearly physically changing all the time, you are steeped in this aesthetic about impermanence. So Yugen also includes the sense that the entirety of something can't be seen at one time, can't be seen from one perspective. Gardens, again, laid out in such a way that every bend is a different view. It's a different scene. It's quite intentional. We certainly see this in Dogen's writing. He thoroughly investigates, thoroughly expounds something, often from multiple perspectives, sometimes within the same paragraph, sometimes within the same sentence. There's this, and there's not this, and there's something else. There's this, but because of this, it's that, right? We see him dancing around back and forth, switching perspectives back and forth a lot. It's very directly tied in with this, right? So again, he says things that might seem to be contradictory. He is actually expressing one truth from multiple sides, multiple perspectives. It's absolutely consistent if we understand what he's doing, right? So as we frequently say here in our Dharma family, we see one reality from 2 sides and express 2 sides in one action. Those things are completely consistent and there's no separation. But at first blush, we look at it and go, these things don't match, right? Okay. So let me just finish up with Yugen here. So Yugen kind of goes beyond itself, while by comparison, Sabi is about what's concrete. It's right here. So Yugen is about all of this unexpressed stuff. Sabi is very concrete. It's about what's right here in front of us. So there's this creative tension between these 2 things that runs throughout Japanese aesthetics. We have, that kind of tension. We've also got this tension between loneliness, isolation, detachment, and interdependence, interconnection, interpenetration. We get to hold both of those things. So those are not paradoxes we need to resolve. It's important for us to know it's not that we need to resolve those in favor of one or the other, or somehow figure out how they completely coexist, right? We just need to be able to hold 2 sides equally. So it's like form and emptiness and going beyond form and emptiness. So one other important point is that Zen texts like Shobo Genzo allude to and rely on other Buddhist writings without being terribly concerned about the context of the original. So they quote maybe only as much of that reference text as they need to quote in order to make the point. If they pull something out of context, they don't care. So there's no problem with taking a term or a saying or a story out of context, because the only context that's important is the context of what they're writing right now. So in a little bit, we'll see how Dogen actually does this. So there is complete freedom to take things out of context, and that is really essential to the way he uses language. He couldn't do what he did if he felt constrained by saying, oh, this doesn't mean the same thing. I'm not doing the same thing with it the original author was doing, as he never does. So the freedom to do that is what he really needs in order to do the kind of writing that he's doing. So it's important to understand that Buddhist texts used in this way are seen as instrumental. So they're being used to achieve a particular purpose, rather than being looked at as some kind of sacred, untouchable scripture. If he's quoting some piece of it, he's going to do what he's going to do with it. And there is not a sense that, oh, this scripture can't ever be changed or modified because it's a sutra or because it's a scripture, right? Dogen feels perfectly fine shifting the meaning of a koan story, quoting only part of a line of a sutra, and then going on to show how it exactly illustrates what he wants to say. This little piece of something exactly illustrates what I meant to say, whether the original means that thing or not. So we can get a little bit kind of tripped up with that, right? Okay, I'm going to stop there so that next time we can take up literary genres and some writing forms and continue doing that. Meanwhile, let's see if you all have questions, things you want to ask, things you want to bring up. Again, I can't see people well enough to call on you, so I would say open a mic and say what you'd like to say. Questions, comments?
I have a question.
Okay.
It's very interesting what you were saying about illusion, and I guess you could refer to that as intertextuality in a way.
Hmm.
And you sort of brought it out. I hadn't thought of it before, that it's really sort of an example of interdependence of many different traditions, many different thoughts. Um, it's kind of interesting that I hadn't seen that connection before.
Yeah, well, when we look at the aesthetics, we just see so many ways that they play out. I think it's important if we think about the illusion as an intertextuality. I think we just have to realize that it's not a dialogue.
Right.
In other words, so I know you know, but when I think about that as a word, I think, oh, there's a response, there's a dialogue. So if Dogen's referring to a text or quoting a text, he's not necessarily quoting that text and then responding to it. He's quoting it in order to make his own point that he's already come to that conclusion. Right. So there are certainly places where, he disagrees with what other teachers have said or done or something, but he's likely to take that thing and do what he wants to do with it, right? But
It kind of actually reminds me of, taking pieces of cloth and sewing into a kesa, in a sense,
yeah,
taking little pieces of things and putting it together in a way.
very much. I think that's really true. I mean, when we look at Shobogenzo, most of that text is he's talking about koan stories. So he's constantly quoting. He's quoting koan stories, he's quoting sutra bits, he's doing all kinds of things, as you say, kind of pulling the elements together, right? And again, with all of that illusion, he's covering an awful lot of ground in a relatively small piece of writing because he's incorporating by reference all these things. So no wonder when we take apart some piece of Dogen, we have to go down the rabbit hole and chase down all of those references. We hear Hojo-san talking about Shobogenzo. He's, chasing down all of the references, and you would just think, how did anybody ever know that those two little ordinary words meant this whole other thing? It's kind of crazy. So we're kind of at a disadvantage if we don't have the context, right? And I mean, it's difficult for us to know all the things he's referring to. He refers often to the Lotus Sutra, but he refers to many other things too. So if we don't know, oh, that's a springboard for something, we either roll right over it or we misinterpret it, right? So that's one of the reasons this gets very, very difficult. So I think you're absolutely right. This illusion is not disconnected from teachings about interdependence, right? Interconnection. I think that's a big part of what's contributing to this aesthetic, part of this aesthetic. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Other comments, questions, things to bring up today?
Ogo, this is Fusatsa. Again, when you were talking about how the monasteries were acting and they were positioning Dogen, I didn't go immediately to a place of of judgment. I was just like, oh, that's just how it was, culturally. And I can also do some of the parallels even here with some of our institutions, right? Wanting to, so I was drawing parallels, trying to be, non-judgmental, but at the end you're just like, oh, well, yeah, we wouldn't normally just kind of roll into that, wanting to be like judgmental of what they were doing. But again, it's very interesting to see how it was well thought out, very, very thoughtfully done to really position Dogen, and, how it is really influencing even currently today, how we, to your point that teachers, a lot of them professors reference the Shobogenzo. So, it's become a really primary text for study, and how that was really intentionally, settled and done. But it wasn't, it's like you said, is just the way it is, but it was just interesting to see the intentionality that was put into this.
Oh, it's very strategic. It was very strategic, absolutely. Yeah, and so, we just need to be aware of that, because I think it can be difficult for us. We might read something about Dogen, and then we might, which is maybe not contemporary, but has reference to his early part of his life. And then we read something which was created about him several hundred years later, or we talk to somebody who gives us a particular understanding about what Dogen was doing, and we think, why don't these things line up? There's kind of more than one Dogen story. So like any myth, myths don't have to be factually true to be true. Those stories still tell us something, I think, about the origins of our practice. I don't think we need to label them as bad or discount them or something. Miracle tales as a genre are really interesting. I spent some time in grad school working on miracle tales because I just thought they were so interesting. And most Western practitioners don't know anything about miracle tales, but it's a whole really interesting kind of genre. So Yeah, I think I just like to warn people about our tendency to look at the way these stories are constructed and to think that somehow we've been duped, somehow we've been cheated, or somebody's doing something bad. But, you know, as you say, with nonprofits and organizations today, we all want to be legitimate. We all want to, you know, craft our image in a particular way. And this was no different. This was no different. Other comments, questions? I see a hand waving. Just open up your mic and say what you're going to say.
I have a question about the point at which um, the text became the authority rather than the transmission of practice from teacher to student. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on that and what kind of, there must have been tremendous resistance to that at some level, and just more about that, because that's very interesting.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
That from us today.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think as Westerners, we would go, no, 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 no. You know, my teacher is my authority, and everything the teacher says, you know, is what I believe. And I think there's a real tension there because in our hearts we might think that, and yet how do we typically come to practice? We read first before we ever come into a Dharma center, you know, because that's what's available to us. Our teachers, we might not ever know a teacher. You know, when I used to teach in the college classroom, I was pretty convinced I was the only Buddhist nun these folks had ever met, right? But some of them may have, you know, done some reading. So I think for us in the West, we may come at it one way or the other way or both, right? But I think when this shift happens during the Reformation and the texts become the authority, I think in some ways it's easier to point to a text because a text doesn't change. I mean, it can certainly be edited, it can certainly be revised, but once you adopt a book and say, this is it, this doesn't change nearly as quickly as perhaps the practice that's being transmitted around from person to person, which is being adapted for the conditions and the temple and the people who are there. We all know, go from one Dharma center to another in the West, and that practice is not identical. And we would all say we're practicing Soto Zen, right? So there's something about being able to go back and look at a text. So, I mean, even today, we have something called the Gyoji Kihan, which is the forms manual, the ceremonies manual. We've all got this thing. If we're doing a ceremony, we can go look up how to do it, but it's not going to look the same in every Dharma center because we're not dealing with the same conditions. I mean, even in Japan, we would have to consult that sometimes if we were doing something we hadn't done before or hadn't done in a long time, and we had to adapt on the spot because you do. But yet there's this, you know, practice gets judged against the text. So yeah, it's an interesting shift. And I think in some ways as Westerners, we might feel a little uncomfortable with that because even when it comes to things like Dharma transmission, you know, we don't want to be told there's hoops you have to jump through. We just want to know my teacher says I'm ready to teach, therefore that's good enough for me, right? So I think we have this ongoing unfolding, what is the authority, you know, in our practice? And I think today we might look a little bit less at a text and more at Zazen as our true teacher, right? And awakening as the ultimate authority, if there's an authority, you know, thusness, reality as the ultimate authority, if there is such a thing. But I guess I can understand why several hundred years ago, people wanted to anoint and appoint something which wasn't going to change. And then they could say, we have control of this text. These texts are the rules. It doesn't matter what practice you're doing. It's judged against our text, right? Which we have, you know, in our grasp. Therefore, we have the power. Because if we're relying on practice and practice can change, then we don't quite hold sway in the same way, right? He who controls the text controls the rules. So I'm guessing that's why it went that way. This is another case where there is plenty written about this. I encourage folks who are interested in this to read up a little bit because it's the whole Reformation piece is a very interesting period of our history and one that maybe not a lot of Western practitioners know about. But it really points us toward why we do some of the things we do, why we see Dharma transmission the way we do, why we see Dogen the way we do, why we see our practice the way we do. It's an interesting piece of the puzzle, right? Very good. Other questions, comments, please?
I just thought I'd add to that. You know, there's of course a really interesting parallel with Christianity because during the Protestant Reformation, that's the same thing basically that happened. Was the sola scriptura, I guess, that text alone is like sort of the true authority, and we can forget all the practices that the Catholics have accumulated over time. And I wonder. I mean, I haven't really looked into this seriously, but in Europe, it was associated with rising literacy, and the printing press, and having access to those texts in a way that wasn't available before. And during the Tokugawa era as well, literacy rates rose a lot in Japan. So I wonder if that might not be related as well. So
I'm sure that's probably true, and I suspect, if you were a monk in a temple, you probably had a fair degree of education, I would guess. Do you think that's true? I mean, it was true earlier, it might still be true then. So, that was probably, if there was a text and you were in control of the text and you could distribute that text to temples and they could actually read it, then there was no excuse, right? I mean, we gave you the rules, here they are, It's not about, oh, well, but this is the way we do it here. It's, here's the text. So I wouldn't be surprised if rising literacy didn't have something to do with that, right? Yep. Other comments, questions?
I was to follow on what Doji was saying, is that I was thinking also in contemporary life, we see the same kind of dramas played out in the Supreme Court with the originalists who are turning back to the Constitution and defending whole perspectives in contemporary social actions.
Sure.
In the same spirit, and
Sure.
vice versa.
Well, and it's interesting, even in terms of our own practice, to think about, what do we turn to figure out what pure practice is? Because in the West, we're sometimes uncomfortable with cultural trappings. I don't like the word, right? But like underneath all of those exotic Asian forms, there has to be something universal, and what is that? So we keep wanting to strip back and peel back, and somehow we think that we can get back to some kind of practice which is completely not dependent on culture. But, the Buddha was practicing in his own culture, in his own time, and what he did was influenced by that. So it's like, where do we actually look? It's difficult to look at practice which changes. So that kind of founding document. So it's the Constitution, it's Dogen's text, it's the Bible, it's something. We want something to point to that says, this is it. Here are the answers. All the answers are here. So now we can stop debating because, here are all the answers. Well, what if your text is open to interpretation? We have a problem. Other things folks would like to say? Yeah, this is clearly not a new arc in the human story, right? This is what we do as human cultures, as human organizations. Nothing new under the sun. What would others like to say?
Yeah, just a clarification question. I think I missed when you originally referred to it. What does the Reformation period refer to? Is that the 18th century when Menzan period? Is that what you're referring to?
It's generally Tokugawa or Edo period. So 1603 to 1867 is Tokugawa. So that's the point where these the dynamics start to unfold, right?
Okay.
So when all of these, the divvying up all of these temples between Eiheiji and Sojiji and who's in charge, and we see these two temples kind of, vying for power, then somebody wants to step up and say, okay, how do we know? How do we know what Dogen really meant? So if we're going to base everything we're going to do on Dogen, how do we know what Dogen really meant? So that's when that really starts to bubble. But it goes on for a while. That is not a short process. Not at all a short process. So Manzan and Menzan are your guys. If you folks want to read more about that, again, more has been written about that. We're covering it pretty quickly. But that too is a very interesting story. It's like we might think that our Kinhin practice goes back to Dogen. We don't actually know if he did Kinhin or what kind he did. That was reconstructed in about late 1700s out of documents. Reformers tried to put something together to say this is the walking practice Dogen did. We don't really know. So we have a practice, and we would like to think we're looking at a document, but we don't really know. other things today? Questions, comments?
I have a question.
Okay. Hi, Edo.
Hi. I also had some confusion about the Reformation period because I thought originally you were talking about, those those 4 periods in Dogen's life. And the last 12 were, I thought you called the Reformation. But is that true or not?
Okay, that I can see why that was confusing. So again, I was using a structure set out by Stephen Hine. So the names of his 4 periods there were the formative, the transformative, the reformative, and the performative. So the reformative period in the life of Dogen is not the same as the Soto Shu Reformation, and I can see why that was confusing, and I'm glad you clarified.
Thank you.
Anything else for the moment from anybody? Enough for now? Okay. So I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin, and we'll do our closing chant. We have a little bit of time before the next Zazen period, and he can fill us in with that. And tomorrow morning, we will take up literary genres and forms and continue this story. Okay? Thank you very much. Hoshin, over to you.